So I'm very excited to welcome you all to today's speaker series webinar. Today we're going to be joined by Eleanore and Adam, who will be talking with us on wildfire risk in Canada's wetlands. This is our third webinar as part of the Wetlands Institute speaker series. So earlier this month, we were joined by Dr. Catherine Tarasoff on controlling reed canary grass, and then followed by Dr. Irina Creed, who was talking about wetlands as natural climate solutions. If you missed those webinars, a recording of both can be found on our YouTube channel. So I'm excited to announce as well that we have added another webinar as part of this year's speaker series. So you can join the BC Wildlife Federation, the Central Kootenay Invasive Species Society, as well as the Columbia Shuswap Invasive Species Society to learn all about protecting BC's fish and waterways from whirling disease. You can register for that webinar via the QR code on your screen or through the link in the chat that was just sent. So my name is Erica Coley. I am the program assistant for the BC Wildlife Federation's Wetlands Education Program. My colleague Emma is also on the call with me today and will be helping with some back-end tech support, as well as sharing some things in the chat. So before we begin, I want to acknowledge that we do have people joining us from across what is known as British Columbia, who are all on their own personal reconciliation journeys. I would like to humbly acknowledge and thank the 203 First Nations who, since time immemorial and to this day, have lived in relationship with and stewarded these lands that we are all privileged enough to call home. The BC Wildlife Federation's office is located on the unceded, ancestral, traditional, and temporary territories of the Semiahmoo, Stolo, Wasanich, Kwantlen, Chemainus, and Hulkaminam Treaty Group nations in what is commonly known as Surrey, British Columbia. As we are all joining today's webinar from different locations, I encourage you to spend some time learning about the First Nations whose territories you live on and visit. As part of the work we are doing in the Wetlands Education Program, we are trying to bring more meaning to our land acknowledgements and, where possible, center the education that we provide on reconciliation actions. So today, to go beyond a simple land acknowledgement, I wanted to share a moment in my reconciliation journey that has been most impactful to me. So while I currently call Vancouver home, I grew up in Toronto, Ontario, which is the territory of many First Peoples, including the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, Wendat, and Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. It's a territory under Treaty 13, as well as the Williams Treaty, and it falls within the Dished with One Spoon Wampum. And now, like I'm sure many of us can relate to, when I attended university, my worldview expanded. So there I was introduced to feelings of discomfort, which is something I had been privileged to not have experienced much of in my life till then. And the specific instance of discomfort I want to share today stemmed from the first time I was part of a smudging ceremony. I didn't understand what I was doing. I didn't know how to do it correctly, and it was different to anything I had ever done before. And because I didn't want to make any mistakes, and I was too scared to ask any questions. Thankfully, this was not the last time I was ever given the opportunity to participate in a smudging ceremony. And by embracing this feeling of discomfort and unknown that I had, I was able to put myself in a position where I was lucky enough to learn about and act on reconciliation and braiding knowledge systems from amazing people, both in Ontario and here in BC, through stories, life experiences, and conversations. And I am incredibly grateful to those who have shared with me their time and knowledge. My hope today, by sharing this story, is that we can think of land acknowledgements as more than just a box to check, and take the time to think of their role in our own reconciliation journeys and our role in our own reconciliation journeys. With that, I also will say that as a nonprofit, we rely on grant funding, partnerships, memberships, donations, and sponsors. So I'd like to thank the funders that have helped make this workshop, this webinar, and our other workshops possible at no cost. If you've ever never heard of the BC Wildlife Federation, we are the BC Wildlife Federation, and we are dedicated to conserving water and enhancing watersheds. We use innovative conservation tools, restoration methods, and educational programs. Our team protects and restores wetlands and watersheds across BC for future generations. Our wetlands education program is part of the BC Wildlife Federation's watershed team. We've been running since 1996 to conserve wetlands and water. We offer workshops in communities throughout British Columbia to provide knowledge and tools for you to be wetland stewards in your own backyard. If you have an idea for a wetland project, or if you're ever interested in a program being hosted in your community, please reach out to us. We're always keen to create more partnerships when possible. And if you're interested in learning more about our organization or our team, you can find our website and social media accounts through the QR code on your screen or the link in the chat. You can join our mailing list to stay updated on workshops and new information. Our mailing list is generally sent out 4 times per year. A little housekeeping notes before we get into the presentation. I'm sure most of us have used Zoom before, but please submit your questions that you have through the Q&A icon at the bottom of your screen. They will be answered during the Q&A period at the end of the presentation. Feel free to use the chat if you want to let us know where you're calling in from, share any comments or resources with everybody on the call. And for those who would like, there's also a closed caption button to turn on subtitles for your device. Last thing before we get started, at the end of the webinar, there will be a quick survey that pops up on your screen. It's only a couple of questions, so it should take you less than 2 minutes to fill out. We do ask, if possible, that you fill out this survey, as your feedback helps us improve our programming and is crucial to support our grant applications and reports. So if you could take a few minutes to fill it out, we would be extremely grateful. Right, I am very excited to introduce our 2 speakers for today. We have Eleanore, who is currently working towards a Master's of Resource Management from Simon Fraser University with a thesis using remote sensing to study drivers of burn severity. Eleanore has worked as a research assistant studying mountain pine beetle and forest fire interactions in BC, as well as fire ignition conditions in Alberta peatlands. She earned her Bachelor's of Science from the University of Toronto, specializing in forest conservation science and GIS. We also have Adam. Adam graduated from the University of Guelph in 2023 with a Bachelor's of Science in Environmental Sciences. He's majoring in ecology. Adam is now starting his Master's of Resource and Environmental Management. His research is focused on testing fire-smart treatments to help reduce the risk of wildfires to communities within Canada's boreal ecozone. With that, I will stop sharing my screen and give our speakers the chance to share theirs.
All right, just let me know if that came up okay.
Yep, that looks great. It's all yours.
Awesome. Well, thank you everyone for coming to our talk on understanding wildfire risk in Canada's wetland, and thanks to BC Wildlife Federation for hosting this and letting us come out today. Sorry. There. Quick little overview of our presentation today. We're going to do a little bit about us and give a little bit of a deeper dive into what research we're currently doing. And then we're going to give you a quick little background on wildfire. We're going to introduce you to peatlands, which are going to be our wetland of choice today. And then we're really going to try to dive in and give you a good picture of fire and peatlands and what that looks like, followed by the challenges that you see with that, and then a little bit of a small case example of Burns Bog, a local peatland in the Lower Mainland that hopefully some of you have been able to visit before.
Okay, wonderful. So as mentioned before, Adam and I are both in our first year of our Master's of Resource Management in the Fire and Ecosystem Research Lab at Simon Fraser University, supervised by Dr. Wilkinson. And our lab focuses on asking questions about the drivers, impacts, and future of wildfire across ecosystems within Canada. And we place an emphasis on the interaction of fire with industry and society. So just a little bit about my research. It focuses on using satellite imagery to observe and model trends in wildfire over time and across provinces. So just as an example close to home, this is a fire that burned in Chilliwack in 2018, with the darker pixels indicating areas that burned more severely. And we can get this data based on changes in vegetation that we can detect by satellite. So we can combine this type of information with other environmental attributes to ask questions about the factors contributing to spatial patterns that we see in bird landscapes. And part of the reason that I really like working with remotely sensed and satellite imagery data is there's a big backlog of it. So we can start to look at historical trends and how things are shifting over time.
Awesome. And like mentioned, my research is looking into novel fire smart treatments within our boreal forest. The term fire smart is being used a lot more commonly nowadays within BC and around Canada. And it's kind of got three main goals that you're working towards in these treatments, which are to reduce forest fuel ignition potential, reduce fire intensity, and aid in the efficiency of suppression efforts. The boreal forest itself has presented its own challenges with wildfire as it promotes high intensity stand replacing fires. In these photos here, you can see pictures of my research site in Alberta and some of the fire smart treatments we've already implemented. And just a quick note, as much as these sites do look very forested, this is a treed peatland, so it is covered under our wetlands.
Wonderful. Okay, so let's get into some fire ecology. So fire has always been a part of Canada's landscape, especially in the boreal forest. Out of all of the disturbances that Canada's forests experience, such as pests or windthrow, fire is the largest one. And disturbance is good for forests in moderation since it mixes up the landscape by introducing patches and pockets of different forest succession, which brings about different plants and new growth. So I'm going to walk you through this figure here, starting at the chipmunk. A forest that has just seen a fire. The forest floor is getting sunlight for the first time in a while, so we see a lot of new growth of plants that haven't had the opportunity to grow beforehand because they've been shaded out. So this provides a lot of food for our wildlife, and this is when you see a lot of shrubs and a lot of berries. And as the forest grows, moving across to this moose and this bird here, these species begin to get shaded out by other species. And up at the top here, you can see what a forest might look like that experiences no fire with really dense tree stands that allow no light for lower plants. And this can allow dead wood to accumulate, which means that when it burns, the fires are a lot hotter. But and this is what a forest landscape would look like under fire suppression. So if you don't allow the landscape to burn, say because you wanted to log it or because it's in close proximity to where humans live. But if the system is burned, it remains part of this cycle and this circle. And again, it opens up area and introduces more plant species and diversity. So mixing up the landscape with fire in this way is good for forest health as it increases the diversity of species and introduces a mix of tree ages. And this helps with the ecosystem's resilience or its stability and ability to restore itself. However, recently, we have seen a shift in these fires in recent decades. So a fire regime is the term that we use to refer to the time of year that fires occur, the frequency that they occur at, how big they get, how intense they are, and how severe they are. And this has been changing in recent decades, as I'm sure you've heard about these bigger, scarier fires within the media. So we can map this change in fire regime shift. This map shows area burned over different years. In the first category, the light orange, we can see fires that burned between 1919 and 2016. And as you can see, these are small and they're spread across the landscape, but relatively small. And moving on to the orange category, which is fires that burned from 2017 to 2022, they begin to get a lot bigger. So we can see in the center of the province here, some of those big patches and up north along the border as well. And in the dark red, we have only one fire season, 2023, and we can see in the top right corner some really, really big fires. So drawing your attention to this pie graph, this shows the 10 largest fire seasons in Canada. And again, each slice seems to be getting bigger over time, with 2023 making up nearly a quarter of this chart. So the reason for this fire regime shift is multifaceted. As mentioned before, Canada has a history of total fire suppression where we have extinguished most of our fires. And this has led to fuel accumulation, which creates a continuous blanket of material available for burning on the landscape. Prior to suppression, Indigenous people took care of the landscape with cultural burning to keep the forest productive and healthy. But then in the 1890s, the government made that illegal. So we basically have big piles of wood and leaves on the ground all across the country, accumulating over decades. And when you combine this with the drought and the increased temperatures that we're seeing with climate change, all of this has led to more frequent, larger, more severe fires and a longer fire season. So when you're hearing about Canada's fire regime, you typically think of a forest fire, and that's pretty much what I've been talking about so far. But wetlands can also burn if they have enough accumulation of organic matter, which is what we refer to as peat.
And fens, bogs, muskegs, what do these all have in common? Well, they're all peat-forming wetlands. And these are all areas that you might have been to before, not either realized it was a peatland, or you could have been in an area that was so forested you didn't even think you were in a wetland itself. But these are all susceptible to wildfires. And just kind of moving forward, we're going to kind of refer to these all as peatlands, just a little generalization. But altogether, each of them, they are different at the end of the day, and they can burn. And there we do have peatlands across Canada from coast to coast. They take up 12% of Canada's area. It's quite crazy. Looking over towards BC, you do see a little bit less, but it is speckled around there, and a higher concentration in the northeast corner. Canada does have about 25% of the world's peatlands, which is quite crazy.
Okay, so peatlands form in low-lying, waterlogged environments, and these wet conditions slow down the rate of decomposition that happens in them. So this means that the area is accumulating more plant material than it is breaking down. And this results in the formation of layers of organic material stacking on top of one another, building up on top of the dead material underneath. And this organic matter, again, is what we refer to as peat. So in this picture on the top right here shows a peat profile. And this is hundreds of years of moss accumulation stacking up in a gradient of decomposition, where you have at the bottom very fine organic material, and then at the top more intact peat. And to be referred to as a peatland, ecosystem must have about 40 centimeters or more of this material. The key species in peatland ecosystems is sphagnum moss, shown in the bottom right image, and it is a primary contributor to peat formation. Sphagnum moss is highly efficient at retaining water due to its structure, and the moss holds large amounts of water in its cells, which helps maintain the waterlogged conditions necessary for peatland ecosystems. It draws water up from the water table, making even the higher hummocks of the landscape water saturated. And what do I mean when I say hummock? Well, peatlands are made up of hummocks and hollows. Hummocks are the raised mound-like areas that are formed by dense growth of moss and other plants, whereas hollows are the low-lying depressed areas that are wetter and more waterlogged. And these areas can hold standing water, especially in winter seasons. So just another view here, more of a cross section. You can see those lower lying hollow areas might full of water, and then the higher hummocks would be all this green space in between, and it's all sitting on a bed of decomposed sphagnum moss, which is peat.
And peatlands can store a tremendous amount of carbon. Water saturation in these peatlands reduces the amount of oxygen and slows decomposition. Normally, when plants die, microbes break them down into simple organic compounds, releasing carbon dioxide back into the atmosphere. However, in peatlands, the lack of oxygen significantly reduces this decomposition, leading to a much slower rate. As a result of this, plant material accumulates gradually over time and turns into this peat soil, which essentially is a dense carbon-rich material made of these decayed plants. The peat builds up over centuries to millennia, acting as long-term carbon stores. Over time, the thickness of the peat layers increases, further trapping more carbon within the soils and preventing release into the atmosphere. Peatlands in Canada can store currently estimated up to 150 billion tons of carbon. That's equal to 25 years of Canada's current greenhouse gas emissions. Once carbon is stored in these peatlands, they can usually remain there for thousands of years undisturbed and intact. The slow rate of decomposition in these peatland ecosystems is the key to keeping the carbon stored in a safe place. When you start looking at peatlands above ground, they can have a variety of different vegetations on top. You can have some open peatlands where you only see your like mosses and a few grasses on top, to your treed peatlands that are mainly dominated by black spruce, a tree that's really well adapted to grow in these low-lying wet conditions, as well as shrubby peatlands that you might just see a bunch of different shrubs and sages across them. And they also have some very cool vegetation if you get to ever visit one or walk through them. Peatlands in the summertime have a variety of really cool plants. You can see we have our sundews, which is one of Canada's coniferous plants, to our bog orchids. There's a variety of beautiful colors you can see in the bogs, as well as a ton of berries, including cloudberries. Like the majority of Canada's ecosystems, peatlands are also adapted to wildfires. Some systems are adapted in a way to burn and recover quickly, but peatlands have traits that make them pretty resilient to fire, allowing for a heterogeneous landscape of burned and unburned area, leaving habitat for wildlife. And before we get too deep into talking about fire and peatlands, I really want to talk about things that affect fire behavior. One of the first things is weather, whether it's a hot day, the humidity, precipitation, wind speeds all affect fire. Topography also plays a large factor in that, whether it's on a slope or aspect of where you are. But fuel is the main name of the game when it comes to peatlands. Fuel is pretty much any organic matter that can burn. And so going back to everything we learned about how peatlands accumulate, all the layers of peat underneath the ground level, that's all available fuel to burn. All that carbon that's stored can burn, as well as all the vegetation on top. Peatlands are actively resistant to fire in a way that the vegetation has high moisture content, and a high water table prevents the fires from burning too deeply. The structure and moisture content of moss species like sphagnum help prevent the spread of fire across the surface. Even though sphagnum mosses can burn when they get dry, it generally does not dry out to the extent where it becomes highly flammable unless the water levels drop pretty drastically. In this picture here the pictures here are from an experimental burn in Alberta, where we've set fire to different fire smart treatments to see how they would hold up against a potential fire. This is our supervisor, Dr. Wilkinson, next to a hummock of sphagnum moss after the fire. As you can see, the landscape around it is pretty burnt, but the mound or hummock of sphagnum is only charred. And this is due to the amount of moisture within these sphagnum hummocks. And since it survived, it can help regenerate the remaining vegetation in these parts, because these hummocks hold spores and other plant parts that can help reestablish. But when peatlands do catch fire, the fires can either start within the peatlands or on the uplands, and our fires start, unfortunately, by human causes and by natural causes with lightning. And the fire return interval in these areas is generally around 80 years. But when they burn across the surface fuels, consuming the shrubs, the trees, the surface mosses, and organic material, all the fuels. But remembering that peatlands can be up to 40 centimeters deep of organic material, there's also loads of fuel underground that can burn. And all that stored carbon can then start to be released into the atmosphere. And the things that affect this are the moisture contents, again, the water table or the groundwater, as you can see in this diagram, the fuels, so the different vegetation available, the initial fire behavior. So if a high intensity fire came in from the uplands versus a low intensity fire, and as well as the weather conditions before, whether you're experiencing lots of drought conditions or high temperatures. When the fire does get into these peat areas and burn down into the deep layers, you don't get a large flame like you'd see in the canopies. You get this smoldering combustion, which is the primary form of peat combustion. It's not as hot, it's less intense, but when it comes down to it, it's very challenging to extinguish. The peat fires can be hard to extinguish because they burn deep. The smoldering can propagate down into the layers of peat, and just by dumping water on top of these areas, you won't be able to extinguish all of it. As much as these fires can burn down, they can burn across and pop up in new areas, starting new surface fires, as the underground is just a continuous layer of fuel that's available to burn. And all that fuel can help this peat burn for extended periods of time. Extended periods of time, it's pretty crazy that these fires have so much fuel down there that they can burn for months, even over winter, and stay there over winter and pop up in the springtime. And we kind of call these ghosts or zombie fires. And just last year, we reported 150 of these so-called zombie fires that overwintered and came back up. And just a little bit of my own experience. In 2023, I went to Wood Buffalo National Park as a Parks Canada wildland firefighter. Wood Buffalo National Park is in northern Alberta, bordering Northwest Territories. It goes into both. And on one of the days out there, we were sent out to extinguish some remaining hotspots. And we came across this small smoldering area that's pretty much no larger than a kitchen table. And to extinguish just this one area, it took a couple people digging it up, kind of mixing up the soil so you can expose all the smoldering areas. About 2 to 3 buckets of water from a medium helicopter, so coming up to 1,000 to 1,500 liters of water use total. And then just going back and forth between mixing in water, taking off your glove to see if there's any heat left, and going back in, maybe calling in more water. And just this one spot took over 2 hours to extinguish. And we were not the only crew working on extinguishing hotspots like this today. And this was not the only hotspot we found today. So that's just a small example of how hard these parts are to extinguish and how resource intensive they can be. But when it comes down to these peatlands burning, they can release significant amounts of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases. These peats also release mercury into the atmosphere at a rate of 15 times greater than your upland forest, which is a greater concern for human health if you're in an area that's getting smoked out by fire. Remembering from the map earlier that peatlands only cover about 12% of Canada, well, peat fires across Canada emit about 6 million metric tons of carbon annually, while fires across all of Canada as a whole emit 27 million metric tons. This making them a large factor to total emissions from wildfires. But historically, peatland fires wouldn't be as bad. They would be a refuge, and the fire could start to burn from an upland site and encroach on a peatland, and the fire would either slow down because it would hit its high moisture content, or it could even extinguish itself. And this is something that fire managers could sometimes rely on as fire breaks. But however, we're starting to see climate change affect these areas too. With higher temperatures in these ecosystems, it's starting to, in drier conditions, peatlands are starting to potentially dry out and experience drought. These are kind of starting to shift peatlands from a fire refuge to a fire source. Peatlands are also facing degradation to human activity. This here is a picture of, on the top left, of a drainage ditch meant to drain out a peatland so we can use this area to harvest it. We harvest peatlands for agricultural and garden reasons. You can usually find your bags of peat moss mix in your gardening stores. And when a peatland is dried out like this for agricultural reasons, it makes it significantly vulnerable to fire as well, as all that material is already pre-dried out and available to burn.
Okay. It is known that fires can burn more easily through drained and degraded peatlands due to their lack of hydraulical stability. Peatland harvest also severely lowers the water table since they drain it. And another thing that can do this is extended periods of drought and increased temperature. And so when the water table is lowered, it makes a lot more available fuel for burning. And so this means when the fire burns down into the peat, usually the water table is like what's stopping it, but it can just keep going. And these ecosystems can reach a critical point of drought or of degradation where they're less likely to recover after a fire because they're so hydraulically out of balance. And once a peatland's resilience is surpassed, it may shift from a carbon sink to a carbon source since it's released so much of the stored carbon into the atmosphere. And this can further exacerbate climate change.
An example of a local peatland is Burns Bog. And although Burns Bog is located in the delta and the lower mainland area, this bog shares a lot of the same vegetation characteristics you might see in arboreal peatlands, like the ones we've generally been talking about. It's got the same sphagnum mosses, it'll have feather mosses, bog orchids, sundews, as well as having variation between treed portions, shrubby, and even open areas. Unfortunately, this bog has burned many times. It's experienced 8 fires in the last 48 years. Burns Bog has kind of taken a beating. As said earlier, 80 years is generally the return interval for fires in peatlands, and having 8 of them in the last 48 years has taken its toll on Burns Bog. But what kind of impacts do we see on Burns Bog from this? Well, although fires are natural in these areas, too many fires can take its toll. Frequent fires, like the ones Burns Bog is seeing, has promoted the succession of non-wetland species. This happens because some of these non-wetland species, like the pines, are well adapted to frequent fires and recover quickly after them, leading this to outcompete your natural peatland species and taking over the area. This kind of drastically changes the vegetation of the bog. As these species require more water, they can start to dry out the areas. They draw more water from the water table. This encourages a shift of species towards those preferring drier environments and further creating an environment less like your natural peatlands, shifting towards elsewhere. The same scenario is kind of at concern for peatlands across Canada, whether it's one that's being degraded for harvesting and being dried out, or ones that are experiencing really frequent fires. There is a concern that there can be a shift of these peatland species to irregular upland species. An example of Burns Bog is doing a lot of restoration work to combat this. In the top right photo, you can see just how dense these pine seedlings are growing back after the fire. And what they're doing is they're removing these as fast as they can to help remain that moisture content within the soils. And on the left photo, you can see just how big of a pile of these pine seedlings they've already torn up in these areas to help continue the restoration process.
Okay. Burns Bog is also home to the endangered red-listed southern red-backed vole. And although Burns Bog has been hammered with fire after fire through the years and a dysregulating species shift, this endangered vole is still there. As we can take a lesson from this, that nature finds a way if we let it, and these peatland ecosystems are adaptable and resilient. However, through fire regime shift, changing climate weather, and peatland degradation, humans are pushing the limit of peatland's capabilities to maintain their ecosystem stability and function. These ecosystems require protection and conservation in order to maintain their equilibrium. So this is a picture from Flow Country, a peatland complex in Scotland that spans over 200,000 hectares. And in July 2024, this became the world's first peatland to be designated as a UNESCO World Heritage Site. So this is indicative of a larger shift towards the recognition of peatlands as important ecosystems and the movement towards more research and conservation of them. I also have more good news that degraded peatlands respond really well to restoration. Although peatlands have been under attack by fire, climate change, and harvesting, with our help that they can bounce back. Techniques like re-wetting, where you flood a peatland, creating the natural wet conditions it needs for native plants, species to recolonize, or other strategies like the moss layer transfer technique, which is basically when you take moss from a donor site and transfer it to the degraded site and spread it around. And then these plant fragments, rhizomes, roots, seeds, and spores can begin to make home there and reestablish there. Peatland restoration has many clear benefits, including return of the moss cover, high and stable water table conditions, net carbon sequestration, and these all contribute to advancements in ecosystem function and return of wildfire resilience. So if you're wondering about what you could do to help preserve peatlands and this really important ecosystem, you can get involved by going peat free. So there isn't a ton of peatland eco complexes in southern BC, but there is a lot of peat around found in, because since it's a common ingredient in potting soil, since it retains moisture so well, you can see its benefits that it would have in gardening. But we encourage you to go peat free by reading your soil labels and not purchasing any potting soil with any of the words seen in bold here in the ingredients. Or even better, you could skip the purchase of soil altogether and make your own compost. By lessening the demand for harvested peat, we can help contribute to keeping peat in the ground and undisturbed, maintaining its carbon stores, moisture levels, and disturbance resiliency.
Just kind of as we wrap up here a little bit early, tons of time for some questions if you have any. Just wanted to leave you with some resources on how you could potentially protect your own home or someone else's home you know of if you're in an area that could potentially be impacted by wildfires. BC Fire Smart page has loads of resources that you can take home. They have everything from emergency preparedness checklists to tips on how you could protect your own home from fires, as well as ways to help get a professional over to give you a personal assessment on your property and provide recommendations. BC Wildfire Service also has a great app and website that can keep you informed on any fire danger ratings, as well as updates on active fires, road closures, evacuations. I would highly recommend using these resources, especially the app, if you're one to love to get out in the wilderness in BC in the summer times. It's awesome to stay safe. And these are also good ways to help protect yourself, and you can even report fires through them. Both of these are great, and they come up easy with a quick search, whether you're looking for Fire Smart BC or Wildfire Service BC. I'm sure most of you have already heard about these resources or either have the app or similar stuff like it download, but I always want to remind people as it's already starting to get close to summertime just around the corner.
Wonderful.
And yeah, we're happy to answer any questions. We're a bit ahead of schedule, so feel free to ask away.
Thanks for your attention.
Awesome. Thank you, both of you. Thank you so much for that. If you do have any questions, feel free to submit them in the Q&A box at the bottom. There is one or two questions, and I do have some myself. The first one, I will say, Sarah made a fun comment in the Q&A, which I do apologize if the chat box isn't working for everybody, if that may be a setting issue on our end. But Sarah says wonders what the Coast Salish name for Burns Bog is, and maybe calling it Burns is bad luck with all the fires that they've been having. So, Sarah, if you ever figure out what the Coast Salish name is, or maybe I'll do some research on that myself, feel free to send us an email and let us know. We did have a question. Somebody's asking if you could touch a little bit more on the impacts peat farming has on fires and fire severity. They're not sure how much peat farming actually happens in Canada, but it is still quite prevalent in the EU.
Yes. Do you want that?
Here we go back to this slide. I think you know more about these machines.
Yeah, farming really exposes the peatlands to fires. I can't remember off the top of my head exactly how much area is impacted by peat farming. But essentially what they do is when they dry out these areas, they take these big machines you can see in the back corner, and they just vacuum off the top layers of peat. And generally they can vacuum up to like 3 to 5 centimeters, depending on the density of the peat. And it doesn't seem like a lot, but peat only accumulates at generally a rate of like 1 millimeter a year. Um, so that can drastically take away from that minimum of 40 centimeters deep our peatlands are. And just from removing layers of topsoil and it being completely dried out, it's just available to burn. And the severity is higher, the water table is lower, so it can even burn deeper than it generally would if it was a natural peatland and you have that water table as a buffer generally. But yeah, they're just completely exposed. All of the natural things they would have to make them resilient to fire have been completely stripped away.
I think as well there's I don't know how much peat harvesting there is in British Columbia, but there is more in Alberta. Yeah.
Yeah, I do think peat farming in BC is much less, but just from talking to people, but yes, it is still quite prevalent. I keep saying prevalent in Alberta. Thank you for that. We do have a question, or perhaps a comment from Ben saying, didn't think that muskeg was an actual wetland type. I don't know if you want to talk on that at all.
Yes, it isn't really, it's kind of a nickname. Just kind of wanted to throw all the names out together that kind of get used in peatlands. Some people use muskegs and it is like a bog or a fen, or it is not a true peatland where that peat isn't 40 centimeters deep, but it has peat characteristics where you see in the layers of moss on top, and it can either have like a couple centimeters of peat. But in my experience, I've heard muskeg used in a lot of bog situations in Northern Ontario. But yeah, kind of a nickname.
Yeah, it's not like a class as like fen and bog have different meanings hydraulically from where they get their water sources. And I think muskeg's much more of like a colloquial term where it's just more like used in smaller circles. Like rurally, I feel like I've heard you say that a lot on like the fire line and in more kind of like industry settings where the distinction between these like types isn't really as important. I mean, asterisk because it probably is. Yeah, it's just like more of a word to refer to that like wet kind of landscape.
Yeah, I know people have a lot of different colloquial terms that are used to define different wetland types. I know muskeg. Somebody told me that muskeg is a very common term used in Scotland, where they were from. So, okay, there is a question about whether the Burns Bog Society is still actively doing restoration efforts. Do you know this?
From my understanding, yes. But I haven't worked with them directly. I know our lab is potentially starting some relationships there to do some research. But the photos added there were from one of our volunteers in our lab that's done that work in the last couple of years. So if that answers it, but that's the biggest update I have on that.
Well, thank you. And I know the Burns, excuse me, the Burns Bog Society does have an online presence as well. So they do have a website as well as social media pages. So you can find those online. And if I find a link in the next few minutes, I can maybe send it into the chat. Okay, this is from Sally. When replanting trees after a fire in a bog, would you plant for present conditions or for the climate in 30 to 50 years?
That's cool.
That's a very good question. Do you want to?
I feel like when you're restoring a bog, you wouldn't usually plant trees in it. Think that makes sense?
Not necessarily.
I think, yeah, I think more when you're restoring the bog, you're focusing on like restoring the water table and the peat and getting like a much wet situation. And if you were to plant trees too early, that would probably draw a lot of water like out of the system before it's reached that like stability that it used to have. Um, and I feel like a lot of the planting that happens in Canada is for past conditions. I think that like they've in my experience they started to do some sort of studies on like range shift and different species, but it's not really like common practice yet to introduce like species for drier climate conditions. It's a cool
I know
question though.
that is a very hot topic at the moment of restoring for current conditions or future climate conditions. Potentially a research avenue.
Mhm.
Let's see, what else do we have here? We have a question. How is your current focus on peatlands shaping or identifying questions you would like to explore in the future?
I'll take a little bit. Something that I think is really cool is a lot of the like fire management side of this. So like a lot of the fire behavior protocols that the government has, and a lot of the fire weather indices and things like this, they haven't really been built with peatland as like a fuel type in mind. And so I think it's really cool the more like research we get on how these sorts of ecosystems work, and I'll like to be able to kind of incorporate that, and then how we can have even more reliable modeling and just like knowing what to do in fire scenarios, knowing more how this kind of ecosystem burns, because the sort of classification system that we've built so far has excluded this. So that's the kind of questions that I think of more of like from a management perspective. What kind of like information do we need to make better choices? And including peatlands is definitely a step in that direction. I don't know, you have any?
That pretty much along the same lines as that, just learning how we can better predict fires in peatlands or manage them at the same times. It's that kind of trade-off and balance of fires are natural in these areas, but too many fires are too bad. And just getting a mix of both and making sure that we're maintaining ecosystem health while also being able to protect the communities that are at risk every summer.
I also find it really interesting. As far as like ecosystems go, I feel like peatlands aren't really that sensitive. And so usually when you look into climate change, like how climate change is affecting ecosystems, it's kind of bad news. Like it's kind of like a sad story. And so it's fun to look into peatlands to see like how resilient they are and how capable they are of bouncing back. But it's also a bit alarming that even though these systems are so resilient, they are still kind of facing some trouble. But that sort of perspective of like looking into such a resilient ecosystem is like kind of motivating for me, I find.
Nice. On them being sort of related to them being resilient ecosystems, there is a question on restorations of peatlands. So are there any restoration techniques that you know that could speed up the slow process of peat being formed? Examples like large wood additions to increase decomposition, or anything else that you've come across?
Um, for restoration, one of the main practices is re-wetting these areas. So if you have a drained peatland, you block up those drainage ditches, you bring up the water table. The water table is a huge factor in peatland formation. It creates the low oxygen conditions that slow decomposition, and that starts to form peat again. As well, there's what was the transplants?
Oh, the moss layer
Yeah.
transition technique. Yeah, I think if you're talking more in terms of like how we can encourage these like degraded ecosystems to get back to a point where they're storing a lot more carbon, that's like such a long, lengthy process that I don't think we can like speed up by introducing more like partially decomposed matter. I think it's more a question of like, how can we get this ecosystem back to being healthy, that it's like doing its own thing? Because introducing too many different things can not really throw it out of balance, but just kind of like change the internal like checks and balances that the system has for itself. I know when you introduce other species, it just like changes the amounts of nutrients and stuff that are in the ecosystem. And that can kind of throw the whole thing out of whack and slow decomposition. So I think that really just the fastest way to do it is just to get it back to its healthy state.
Yeah, I know peatland restoration is a very tricky thing just because of the length of time that it takes for that organic matter to build up. And we really should try our best to conserve our peatlands as much so that we're not in a position where we have to restore them. There is 2 questions here from Alex. One of them I'm not quite sure I entirely understand, but I'm going to see if I can make something that might make sense. So they're asking how to treat the interface between, I believe, urban environments and then forest fires. They're specifically looking in North Van. So maybe talking a bit more about managing fires in these urban settings, and then any comments you have on cultural controlled burns to prevent forest fires.
Cool. You take the first one.
Yeah, controlling fires in the wildland urban interface when the forest is getting close to encroaching on communities and other infrastructures. It is a really difficult thing, and a lot of the practices that people are doing are following fuel management techniques, kind of follow under the same like fire smart treatments, where they're kind of removing some of that accumulation of fuel that's built up over the like 100 years of fire suppression we've had in our history. So the removal of fuels coming into our like fire behavioral triangle can help reduce the risk of fires starting in that area as well as lower the intensity. Holding, say, prescribed burns in these areas to also help reduce the amount of fuels in the area. When you get close to communities like that, it gets a little risky, and I know they're not as common and they don't like to host those as much. But there's a lot of different areas. I think like Canmore currently, they're doing a huge fuel mitigation project at the moment to help reduce the fire risk around the community by just removing fuels and trying to bring that forested area back to what you could have seen potentially a couple 100 years ago with a natural fire regime where the forests weren't so dense and thickly packed.
I think prescribed burning or like cultural burning is really, really helpful and useful in kind of mitigating the problems that we're seeing in forest fire. But I think it's one of those things that logistically is like with the system that we have in place now, really difficult to happen. Like I think that there's just so many like safety checks, which are a good thing, but it takes a really, really, really long time, and it's a really long process with like a lot of coordination with a lot of different parties, and also very weather dependent. And so it just takes forever for prescribed burns to kind of like actually happen, which I can see why that's the case, but it is a little bit unfortunate because I do think that they're really beneficial. Yeah. Those
Awesome.
are my prescribed burn comments.
Yeah.
I do think that the government, from what I've seen in my research, the BC government specifically has like recognized the importance of it, and there are some changes happening like policy wise towards getting more of that happening and making that process like kind of easier. But it is like quite a limited window of when it makes sense to burn. Like usually it's in the spring, but sometimes in the fall, where that window's kind of just getting like smaller and smaller since summers are getting so hot, and you don't want to set a fire when there's like really bad fire weather outside. So yeah.
Yeah, I know fires, with the summers being so much hotter, fire risk is, at least with our team when we're doing our restoration work, is becoming increasingly challenging to be able to do work sometimes. And I know it's outside of my department, but I do know within the BC Wildlife Federation, some of our teams are working with First Nations on cultural controlled burns in BC. I was just trying to see if I could find a bit more information on it, but I can't find it at the moment. We'll move on to our last two questions. If anybody else does have any more questions, feel free to put them in the Q&A box. We are almost out of time, so we may actually only have time for these last two questions. So one of them is, what factors should we be considering when deciding whether to actively restore a wetland, such as through hummock transplanting after a fire versus allowing natural succession to take its course?
I'd say the biggest factor there is probably the severity of the burn in the first place. Like a common measurement for that is like depth of burn. So if it's like a pretty low severity fire that didn't really take away or damage that much of the ecosystem, you can rely on it to sort of bounce back. But if it's burnt so much that you've lost a lot of species and you're not sure that they're going to come back, I think that's more when you begin to do these restoration techniques. But I think a lot of the restoration as well is more for harvested peatlands than peatlands that have like experienced fire. Let me know if that's the case.
Yeah, I've seen a lot more stuff about restoration in our harvested peatlands. But yeah, if you're looking into restoration for a peatland post-fire, I think a lot of it has to do with how severe the fire was and maybe how frequent that system sees fires, if it's outside of its regular range that you would expect it. But yeah, if the fires do have a severe depth of burn, you lose those legacy species and those things that help your mosses regrow, like leftover vegetation fragments and spores that help some of the species. So if you're dealing with some severe depth of burn, maybe that's when you'd help the peatland get a little kick back into its natural state and help prevent some of the non-wetland species from taking over first.
Thank you. The last question, I actually will provide a quick answer for as well. And if you have anything else to add, you can. Somebody was just asking where they can volunteer to help restore peatlands. This is a kind of a tricky question because it really depends on where you are located in the province, in the country. I would recommend just researching different conservation organizations and societies in your area that may work in wetlands or peatland or bog ecosystems, and seeing if they have volunteer programs or reaching out to them to see what active restoration work they're doing. So, if you're based out in the Lower Mainland, for example, you can reach out to the Burns Bog Society. BC Wildlife Federation, we do also have a volunteer program that we love to have more volunteers sign up for, and we post opportunities to work on stuff with our team or with partners that we have all over the province. I can send a link quickly in the chat for that program. Adam and Eleanor, I don't know if you know of any other bog restoration opportunities.
No, my work's mainly out in Alberta, so I don't have any recommendations for Vancouver, Lower Mainland area, or in BC itself. But good on you for looking to help volunteer in our wetlands.
I also would like to add that just more on the cultural burning and prescribed burning. The government has some really good reports if you kind of like fish around online on like what they've been doing recently, as well as a paper that Adam and I both read called Right to Burn. Really like kind of outlines the challenges with cultural burning in BC. And I don't know. That was a really good paper, I thought, and really interesting if you're interested in that sort of thing.
Yeah. It covers the certain barriers, systemic barriers set in place against cultural burning and current ways we're trying to mend that, but also some of the ways that are still stopping that in areas. And Dr. Amy Cardinal Christensen is a great researcher who has talked a lot about cultural burning, if anyone's interested in looking into that further.
Perhaps if you can send me a link to that paper and
Oh,
I can
absolutely.
include it in the follow-up email that all of the attendees will get tomorrow. That is the end of our time. I am going to stop the recording now.